The FTC is suing Facebook, attempting to break them up. And under the leadership of someone who seems to be a true badass, or at least aligned with a lot of our things. Lena Khan, who's the, have you read about this woman? So she's the new FTC chair. She's 32.
She's 32.
Like, come on. Like, you're embarrassing.
That's amazing. She's a badass. Yeah.
She wrote a paper in 2017 called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox. Paper went viral in these influential circles. Let's call it like, it went law school viral, I guess. And she argued that the dominance of the tech titans like Amazon show that the U.S. antitrust laws are broken because they're focused on consumer pricing instead of basically like competition. And so the argument is like, well, what do we care? It's not a monopoly if consumers are paying less money. And their argument is that, well, that's a dated view of monopoly.
So basically, the FTC has been filing a bunch of antitrust lawsuits against a number of big tech companies. The news this week is that a judge basically didn't laugh the FTC out of the courtroom, but was like dismissed the case before it even got its day in court. And that was shocking. Like that was not what people were expecting. And the judge gave the FTC basically 30 days, if I'm not mistaken, to improve their case and come back with an improved case before it's able to move forward.
The media has not said this, so I'm going to say it. This was Lena's first shot. Like, some of the things the judge is saying, Judge James Boasberg, that's kind of a cool name.
Boasberg. I don't know.
Anyway, he said a couple things. One, you concluded that Facebook, you being the FTC, concluded that Facebook has a market share of 60%, but back that up with no data, no obvious reasoning. So that feels like a rookie. I don't know enough about law, so I don't know, but that feels like a... No.
Look up for me right now. When was Lena appointed to the FTC chair? I believe it was in the last month. The errors that exist in this case at present predate.
Okay, so not Lena, but still, she's got to know this is.
I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but stuff. So the thing is now is like her first real big move, honestly, as FTC chair, is going to be spending the next 30 days
fixing this, working
to strengthen this case. Like, she's now inherited this problem, and I think the real measure of her, and it's a tall order, so I don't necessarily think we should write her off, even if she doesn't do it, if it doesn't work. But the real measure of her is going to be over the next 30 days when they come back to the judge.
The big hurdle they're fighting, though, is that Facebook bought Instagram in 2012 and WhatsApp in 2014. And those were both reviewed by Antitrust Court at the time. And they found no problem. And then so the judge was like, well, why did you wait so long if you really...
Now, 10 years later, you're bringing an issue
and that's not Lena's fault. That is a number of reasons. So I'm curious your thoughts on... Andrew talks about this a lot. He thinks, they're not a traditional monopoly, but they are, they're selling our data. We get the product for free and they sell our data. And a lot of people don't know that. They don't know the depths of it. There's so many different sides of this. But your thoughts on this in general, Carl, and then where do you think this goes? Yeah. Where do we think we land?
Well, the angle that I feel like has been missing the little bit that I've kind of read and dug into this has always been what does breaking these companies up mean for consumers, right? Like for you and me, why do I care about this? What does it mean for me? And what are the pros of doing this? And you talked about data privacy. I think I don't understand how separating Instagram and WhatsApp from Facebook does anything for my data privacy.
It doesn't. And that's Andrew's point.
Yeah. So I think so I'm like, okay.
What good? He's always said that. What good does it do if you make another Google Maps and a bunch of 5 smaller Googles doesn't increase competition per se. Maybe a little.
Well, but is that the argument? Is that more competition will mean more people trying to woo consumers, and one of the ways they may try to woo us is by having better data privacy settings? Maybe that's the roundabout argument, but frankly, most people don't actually give that much of a shit about data privacy. They're like, I got nothing to hide, fine, take my data. Right. So I don't see that playing out. I think the other argument, I guess, as I've kind of dug into this, is all right, it increases competition for small businesses, for smaller players. That's great. I don't understand how breaking up, again, Instagram and Facebook, does that just set the precedent that Facebook couldn't buy up its competition in the future? I don't really understand how breaking those up necessarily protects smaller businesses. So this is the piece that I've always been confused on is, great, in theory, I guess I'm for breaking up big tech, but I don't actually really understand how it helps me or
Well, the thing is that all the data is owned by Facebook, right? Or these 3 or 4 companies. And the problem is if you want to market in the 21st century, you have to use Facebook. And that's like that's what you're trying to
Google.
avoid, right? That's what you're trying. But no, you have to use Facebook, like king. And so we had a conversation on e-commerce, and we talked about if you're it's amazing for these young companies to come on, like you can hyper target and not have to carry inventory because you know exactly who's buying in real time. But at the same time, you have to use Facebook. And is that good or bad for competition?
But that's because all of the users are there.
No, of course.
And that's where consumers are. And that's not changing if you separate Instagram and Facebook. Like this is, I guess, my point is that like, I don't understand fundamentally what this changes.
It's not going to solve it all.
Sure. And you know, so I'm intrigued by this idea, which I think you got into, or Lena talks about this, and other people in the wake of this court decision have been saying this. We really need to update our antitrust laws to better reflect and encapsulate sort of the internet age. And maybe that would be what we need to solve these things that I'm talking about. But otherwise, I sort of feel like this feels like an elite legal battle. And I don't really care in the sense that like, I don't really know what's in it for me if my data is still just going to be sold ad nauseum and Facebook's still going to have 10 trillion users. Right. And
what's fun for me, Carl, is like let's just take like the conservative argument here where it's like, this is bipartisan, so a lot of people, but there is a certain element where it's like, hey, I'm conservative, I'm pro-business. And like, if you're a country on a global scale, you want your cash cows to kick butt, and then you tax them and you tax your billionaires, the people who make billions off it. And that's good for government programs. Like you want cash cows to fund your government. That all, like, I don't necessarily fully agree with that argument, but I see the logic until you start to see what just happened. And ProPublica did a bombshell report that said, like, we've known that the Facebooks, Amazons don't pay any taxes. So the company itself's not paying any fucking tax. And the billionaires aren't paying any taxes. So
that was the joke I was going to make when you said in there.
We're just doing nothing. We're just letting our rich guys run around. It's ridiculous.
Though I will say, here's then like there's like this like secret Republican in me, and I'm a big fan of like, you know, let's tax these people.
The Tufts Vermont liberal secret Republican. Tell me more about her, Carly.
Well, just more that like, you know, and Jack Dorsey is not like broadly representative, but like he donated 1/3 of his wealth, like $1 billion this year, towards like COVID prevention or COVID research or whatever the heck, women's education and UBI. And I was like, women's education and UBI are basically the two things that I think are going to like save the world. You know, women's education, I think that included like contraception. Like there's so much research on how contraception is a game changer. No country has lifted itself out of poverty in the last 50 years without expanding access to contraception to women. So somebody like Jack Dorsey, for me, it was like that $1 billion was better off in his hands than in the government's hands, where it gets siphoned off to like 10 trillion different, you know, little
at least bureaucratic projects and this and that. But, right. Yeah.
Of course. And that's just anecdotal. And in general, billionaires don't give nearly enough away.
As someone who's worked with a lot of philanthropists,
that's true. That was your gig
most
for
of them have no
a
idea
decade.
what the hell they're doing. Not that the government does either, but you know, like it's like,
right.
Yeah, you got
I'm a fan.
I don't know. At least in government, there's theoretically checks and balances.
Theoretically. I will say the last thing on this, unless you have other super hot takes that you want to share, I do get a kick out of the bipartisan element of this, because it's this fun thing where you have Democrats just in general are in favor of antitrust and government regulation. Yeah. And conservatives just hate big tech. They just like hate Jack Dorsey, and they're like, we're being censored.
It's liberal.
And so like we have this funny, like, you know, come together for very different reasons.
Well, that's what I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet.
On
like,
this issue.
This is one thing everybody kind of agrees on. Like, yeah, you're kind of too big. Like, there's a problem here.
I know. And maybe it speaks to the weakness of the government's case that it hasn't been able to happen yet. I don't know. Who knows?
So this will be... You know, like Zuckerberg has done things that objectively, whether you're really loose, you want to evolve your definition of antitrust laws or stick with the conservative ones. Things where he has been quoted in the email, I think it was 2000. I'm going to look this right up. It was, I don't remember when he actually, I don't know the date, sorry. But he said in an email, it's better to buy than compete. In 2013, there was a social media company called Circle that was growing. And they were competing a competing social network. And when they couldn't buy it, they just cut off access to its data and systems, because that's how they were getting a number of new users and such. And so they stopped. We went from gaining 600,000 new users a day to zero. And that's like what Facebook
Yeah, that's a problem.
do.
And that to me is a question of, I guess this antitrust regulation, like breaking up Instagram and Facebook, prevents that. I'm just not clear enough, I suppose, on whether or not retroactively making changes to the structure of Facebook prevents future actions by Facebook to suppress competition. Presumably, yes, in which case, great, and I'm in favor.
I'm not an expert. Maybe we should get an antitrust law. I'm curious of what, I'd be fascinated to learn what was happening during like the Rockefeller age where you had, like what, and like it was more of the Wild West.
Can I give a fun Rockefeller story?
Go for it.
Okay, this is from AP US History. I learned this. So John Rockefeller, at like the height of his, fortune, success, like richest dude in the world, was taking a tour of one of his like oil factories, and they were putting the oil in the barrels. And he asked them how many drops of glue they used to seal the barrels of oil. And they told him, and he was like, all right, like try it with one fewer. And basically was like, to save costs, was like, how few drops of glue can we use to successfully seal these barrels of oil? And it was just like 16-year-old me was like, that's what it takes to be successful. Like that level of just detail. And like, God, how will I ever like compete with something that like you have all the money in the world and you're still like, how many drops of glue? I want to save that, not even half a cent,
so Meanwhile, you probably got some like poor like factory oil rig worker who's got like rich ass John Rockefeller breathing down his neck, being like, this asshole. First you said 5 drops, now it's 4.